All right, I want to finish up our discussion on China and political institutions. Move into the connections and the factions in China. First, we want to talk again about the Guanxi, which is connections. And this is very similar to a good old boys network, as we would refer to it in Western societies. In the Chinese term means connections or relationships. It is those ties that are based on such things as where you're born, who your friends are. It shows the importance of career ties among individuals as they rise within the bureaucracy and the political structures. Based on ideological differences, oftentimes, and similarities as well, it is one of the primary sources of factions within the Chinese Communist Party. It goes from top to bottom. It's pervasive at the local level, where ordinary people link up with village leaders, and it's existing all the way up through the top of the system. The Guanxi, the connections, are really the keys to getting things done. Cuts through the red tape, but as you can imagine, these sort of off the record relationships can also lead to significant corruption, and we've seen over time significant corruption, but also some efforts to get rid of that corruption. I'm going to have you guys watch a video later today that highlights some of the efforts that the current president has made toward that. So promotions happen all up the hierarchy. High-level members designate lower-level members that they would like to call up. If you remember, this is a comparison to nomenclatura that we talked about in Russia. And I've got my definition here. So a list of influential posts in the government and industry to be filled by Communist Party appointees. So a similarity, if you will, between China and Russia. So what are those factions within China? Well, we've got the conservatives, those that want to preserve the power of the party, control the power, preserve the power of the central government. We've got the reformers, who are more capitalist in their economic mindset. Capitalist infusion into the PRC's economy in favor of open-door trade policies. At different times, they've pushed for membership in the World Trade Organization. They have lobbied the United States to grant a most favored nation status to China, which certainly brings some economic advantages to China as well. So those are the reformers. The liberals are another group. They've been out of power since 1989. And if you think that 1989 date is significant, it really is, because that's also Tiananmen Square. But they are more accepting of broadening political liberties for individuals, democratic movements, and again, some of those things that were behind the Tiananmen Square protests. Also, economically supporting political and economic reform too. The Princelings is another faction that exists. This is sort of the aristocratic families with some credentials that go back to the days of Mao Zedong. The current president would be considered part of this faction as well. Many of the newer class of leaders come from the Princelings faction. The Shanghai Gang is another faction. These are associates, more direct associates of the previous leader, Jiang Zemin. Remember, he's the one that opened China up economically, moving from a command economy to more of a mixed economy. Again, and with the Shanghai Gang, there's an emphasis on the Guanxi, these informal networks that we talked about. And interestingly, 5 of the 7 members of the Standing Committee are from the Shanghai Gang, and 2 of them are Princelings, the current president being a Princeling as well. And the last faction we'll mention is the Chinese Communist Youth League, which is not necessarily significant, but we have at different times seen that faction have a role. Again, I'm going to have you watch a video on corruption in China, but I want you to think about this question or pause this video. So why is the possibility for corruption great under the PRC's system of governing? One reason is the lack of transparency. Decisions, debates, discussions and even ballots are oftentimes made in secret. There's a lack of accountability for government and for leadership. There's no checks on the power of those in charge of the PRC. And then the existence of these informal networks, the Guanxi. All right, so in our triangle, we looked at the party. We're going to take a look here at what the state or government looks like. Now, it does have three branches, but you'll notice this is significantly different from what we see in other of our AP6. They are all controlled by the party there at the top of the pyramid, so China's considered a party state. The CCP is entrenched as the central institution governing the state, and again, they've got representatives at every level of the state, every level of the government. The practices of the party determine basically the practices of the government. The Constitution in 1982 does technically on paper define the institutions and the institutions of the state and the selection of officials, but again, the party has a presence at every step of the process. No independence, no checks and balances. The head of state is the president, and again, the current president is Xi Jinping. He's selected by the outgoing senior leaders of the Standing Committee. Again, think back to that pyramid that we showed on the earlier slide. The Constitution, again, on paper says that the president is selected by the National People's Congress, but again, we know in reality, this person is selected by the Standing Committee. The president serves 5-year terms, and up until very recently, the president was limited to 2 5-year terms. President Xi right now is, I have to check my date there, he's probably 46 or 7 by now, but very recently, the National People's Congress, or the Parliament, passed a constitutional change in 2018 that abolished the 2-term limit. So the president can now be president for life, a la the way Chairman Mao was. So no more term limits for the president in China. What are the roles of the president? The roles of the head of state. Ceremonial head of state, the secretary of the CCP, so the Communist Party, commander-in-chief of the military. Recently, the general secretary of the Communist Party and the president have been the same, but that hasn't always been the case. And I believe Deng Xiaoping was an example of that. The head of the government is Li Keqiang. He's the premier, comparable to a prime minister. He's appointed by the president, but he also always comes from the membership of the Standing Committee. He directs the State Council, which would be the comparable to the cabinet. And the State Council, again, is made up of ministers who direct the tremendous bureaucracy, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So the bureaucracy, there is bureaucracy on all of the levels of government, from the village all the way up to the top. It is huge, it is immense. More than 30 million positions in the bureaucracy. Again, it's very hierarchical, something we see a lot of in China. Kind of, if you think back to even ancient China, this hierarchical structure is something that societally has existed. So made up of cadres, and cadres a cadre is a person who exercises a position of authority in the communist government. A cadre may or may not be a member of the party, and the list of cadre positions covers positions in government and elsewhere, in universities, banks, trade unions, newspapers, any personnel decision that involves an appointment, promotion, or transfer or dismissal that affects one of these 30 million positions on the cadre list must be approved by a party organization department, whether or not that person is a party member. So again, look at the immensity of this bureaucracy and how formalized the process is and the role that the Communist Party has in all facets of the bureaucracy. In recent times, with sort of the shifting toward industrialization in China, there's been a greater emphasis in filling a lot of these positions with technocrats and people with advanced degrees in engineering and management. There's also a mandatory retirement age between 60 and 70, so at some point in there they need to retire. So China recruits people, leaders, through the cadre list for positions. Again, thinks back to what we talked about with Russia, the nomenclatura. So choosing cadres from lower levels of the party hierarchy for advancement based on their loyalty, their contributions to the party, whether or not they're members of the party. But again, they don't have to be members. And as you can imagine, this system is ripe with corruption, especially the further away you get from the metropolitan areas. The Transparency International, and we've looked at their scales before, ranks China 80 out of 180 in their corruption index, and that's from the 2019 list. Just to give you a sense, U.S. is 23 of 180, so it's not good to be a higher number. But having noted that, as recently as 5 years ago, China was 100 out of 178. So they've changed a little bit, but still relatively good amount of corruption within the government. The legislature, so we mentioned this earlier, but we'll come back to it here again. The National People's Congress, again, they have the formal authority to rule on the people's behalf. Again, that's in the Constitution, but again, behind the scenes, you've got the Communist Party controlling most everything. The National People's Congress meets once a year in March for a 2-week session. There are 3,000 members of the National People's Congress. They're called deputies, and they have 5-year terms. They're chosen from lower people's congresses and village township levels, so from the lower forms of government. They have very little power, but they're basically a mouthpiece for the decisions and the policies coming out of the Politburo. So theoretically, the NPC is the top of the power chain. They have the role in selecting the senior leadership, including the PRC president, but they primarily serve, again, as a rubber stamp for those decisions and those appointments made by senior leaders. When we look at the makeup of the National People's Congress, we've got representatives from the semi-autonomous regions. We've got a representative with Taiwanese ancestry that, at least on paper, represents Taiwan. The majority of members in the People's Congress are members of the Communist Party. There are some members of non-communist political parties, but as a result of that, they're pretty powerless as parties, but nonetheless, they are represented. The workers and the farmers are represented about 20% of the deputies. 20% are women, 15% are ethnic minorities. In 2008, 3 migrant workers were elected or appointed to represent the about 150 million migrant workers in China. More than 90% have some level of college education, college degree. More than half of the deputies have advanced degrees. So let's move to the judicial branch. And there's not a lot to say about the judicial branch. The Supreme Court is the highest court, the last resort for all appeals. There are local courts at various levels, all the way from the province on up to the county and the town and up to higher levels. They act both in a civil capacity and a criminal capacity and an appellate capacity. As you can imagine, with the shift away from a command economy to a mixed economy, since the 1980s, the legal system has undergone some significant change and reform to accommodate a more market-based approach, which is essential for the disputes that naturally arise and when you have businesses cooperating or not cooperating with each other. In terms of the criminal justice system, hasn't changed much. It's still known for denying basic legal protections that we take for granted in the West to criminal suspects. Interestingly, the burden of proof in criminal proceedings is on the accused to prove their innocence, as opposed to innocent until proven guilty. In China, the criminal justice system works very quickly. Justice is swift and justice is harsh. 99% of those charged with the crime are convicted, and China today is the leader in the use of the death penalty. All right, let's talk about the third corner of the triangle, so the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. So I want you to read this quote and think about it. If you have to pause the video, that's fine, in terms of what it means in terms of power in China. And it's a quote from Mao Zedong. So political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Our principle is that the party commands the gun, and the gun must never be allowed to command the party. So how does that, what is the meaning of this in terms of power in China? Well, the Communist Party controls the military and will use the power of the military to maintain its hold on power. The military should never have more power than the CCP, and that has been the mission of the Communist Party in China. It was somewhat out of balance at the time of Tiananmen Square. There was some question as to which way the military would go, but ultimately it did stay loyal to and remain under the control of the Communist Party. So the PLA is the world's largest military force in terms of bodies, so 2.3 million active personnel. So this includes ground forces, air forces, and naval armed forces. They've also got an additional 12 million personnel in reserve, so a huge military. Interestingly, to compare it to the U.S., it is a huge military, but the U.S. spends 4 times as much on our military in the U.S. as China does. A key organization in the PLA is the Central Military Commission, the CMC. The CMC is the nation's leading military organ and the commander of its armed forces. It's gone back and forth, but currently there are 7 members of the CMC, so it's going to be the highest ranking military officers of the PLA, plus the president, so President Xi in this instance. The chair is considered the commander-in-chief and has always been the highest ranking party member. All right, so that wraps up political institutions in China. Next week we will move on to our final piece, talking a little bit more about Chinese society and some of the cleavages, and we will go from there.